When you think of the historic Ottoman Empire, your brain probably goes straight to Grand Sultan palaces, elite Janissary warriors, and sprawling multi-continental conquests. What you probably don't think of is a sovereign ruler climbing onto your roof at 3 in the morning just to sniff your chimney. But welcome to Ottoman history, where it had an absolute unhinged fever dream. If you think getting a 1-star review on Google or an angry comment on Yelp is bad for business, you wouldn't have survived 17th century Istanbul. In the Ottoman Empire, food logistics were treated with absolute life or death gravity. The Grand Vizier, or the local magistrate known as a Qadi, would regularly conduct surprise vibe checks on local businesses. They would walk into a bakery with an official imperial scale to weigh the bread. See, if an Ottoman baker tried to skimp on ingredients and sold a loaf of bread that was even a fraction lighter than the mandatory imperial standard, say shortchanging a customer on an akçe worth of dough, which is about $15 in today's money, the punishment was immediate, painful, and intensely public. The inspector didn't issue a fine or shut down the shop. Instead, the executioner grabbed a massive industrial iron nail, lined the baker's head up with his own wooden shop doorpost, and hammered his ear straight into the wood. The baker was left pinned to his own storefront for hours, forced to stand precariously on his tiptoes. If his legs gave out, or if he tried to sit down to rest, he would literally rip his own ear clean off his head. Customers would just casually walk past him, buy their bread from his assistants, and mock him. It was the ultimate graphic warning to local merchants: do not mess with the empire's carb intake, or you will become a permanent wall decoration. Next up, let's talk about the corporate ladder in the Ottoman palace, which was less of a career path and more of a giant box of pure, concentrated PTSD. The highest political office below the Sultan was the Grand Vizier, essentially the prime minister of a massive and girthy empire. It was a high-paying, ultra-status job, but it came with one giant drawback. If the Sultan had a sudden bad mood or suspected you of incompetence, you were instantly sentenced to death.
Let's die, baby.
But the Ottomans established a loophole so incredibly unhinged it sounds like the plot of an anime. A condemned Grand Vizier could save his neck by winning a literal live-action foot race against his executioner. And who was the executioner? The Bostancıbaşı, which translates directly to the chief gardener. Yes, the guy in charge of pruning the royal tulips and planting vegetables was also the guy tasked with deleting your soul. When the death sentence was handed down, the vizier was brought into the palace gardens and given a head start to sprint roughly 300 yards through the royal grounds down to the fish market gate on the southern side of the palace complex, right overlooking the sea. If the Grand Vizier outran the gardener and touched the gate first, his death sentence was completely commuted, and he was safely exiled to a nice coastal town. But if the gardener caught him before he reached the gate, he was strangled right there on the grass. The absolute wildest part of this deep dive research is that this track and field judicial system wasn't a myth. It lasted into the 19th century. The final champion of this death sprint was Grand Vizier Haji Salih Pasha in November 1822, who literally ran for his life, smoked the gardener, and won his freedom. Finally, we have to talk about Sultan Murad IV, a man who inherited a chaotic empire in 1623 and decided the best way to restore law and order was to become the most aggressively bloodthirsty hall monitor in human history. Murad IV absolutely despised tobacco, alcohol, and coffee. He believed that coffee houses and smoking dens were hotbeds where people gathered to hatch plots and talk trash about his government. So he made consuming any of them a capital offense. To enforce this ban, Murad employed a network of literal rooftop spies. These men would climb across the roofs of Istanbul at night and physically sniff the chimneys of private homes. If your chimney smelled like a sneaky, cozy puff of tobacco, the guards would break in, and it was an immediate trip to get your head popped off. Once, Murad caught a palace gardener and his wife sharing a private glass of wine. Instead of a warning, he ordered their legs chopped off on the spot and left them to bleed out in front of an amazed, horrified audience. But Murad's absolute favorite hobby was going undercover. He would dress up as a regular everyday peasant, stalk the dark streets of Istanbul, and ask merchants to secretly sell him some forbidden tobacco or coffee. He would personally decapitate them right then and there on the street. If you managed to survive Murad's reign, his successor was only slightly more lenient. Under the next sultan, if you were caught drinking coffee for a first offense, you got a light cudgeling. But if you were caught a second time, they would sew you into a heavy leather bag and chuck you straight into the freezing Bosphorus River to go kabooey. And yet, despite the literal threat of getting turned into fish food or hunted by rooftop chimney sniffers, the citizens of Istanbul still risk their lives every single day just to get their morning caffeine fix. So that's all I got for today. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.